Sometimes the most ordinary Tuesday morning can become the defining moment of your entire existence. Sometimes a simple knock on your door doesn't just interrupt your coffee. It shatters every assumption you've made about your purpose in life. Marcus Williams had no idea that answering his front door at 6:47 a.m. on a cold February morning would transform him from a lonely widower counting down his remaining years into the father of 5 children who would teach him that family isn't about blood. It's about the courage to love when love seems impossible. What started as a moment of human compassion for a desperate mother and her starving children became a journey that would challenge everything Marcus thought he knew about sacrifice, hope, and what it truly means to live. This is the story of how 6 strangers became a family, and how sometimes the people we save end up being the ones who save us. Marcus Williams stood in his kitchen, stirring his morning coffee with the same wooden spoon he'd used every day for the past 3 years. The routine had become his anchor since Elizabeth died. Wake up at 6, coffee by 6:15, read yesterday's newspaper because he couldn't bring himself to subscribe to anything current, and then spend the day maintaining a house that felt too big and too quiet for one person. At 62, Marcus had perfected the art of invisible living. His neighbors in the suburban Denver community barely noticed the gray-haired man who kept his lawn trimmed and his curtains drawn. He preferred it that way. After losing Elizabeth to cancer and watching their only son move across the country for work, Marcus had convinced himself that solitude was a choice rather than a circumstance. The knock came as he was reading about a local school fundraiser in a week-old newspaper. Not the polite rap of a neighbor or the confident thud of a delivery driver, but something desperate and urgent that made his coffee cup rattle against the saucer. Marcus glanced at the kitchen clock. 6:47 in the morning. Too early for visitors, too late for emergencies that couldn't wait. He walked to the front door, his slippers shuffling against the hardwood floors Elizabeth had insisted they installed during their last renovation. Through the peephole, he saw a woman holding what appeared to be a toddler, with several other children clustered behind her on his front porch. The woman looked exhausted, her dark hair hanging in tangled strands around a face that spoke of sleepless nights and desperate decisions. Marcus hesitated. In 3 years of deliberate isolation, no one had disturbed his carefully constructed routine. He'd grown comfortable with predictability, with the safety of a life where nothing unexpected could hurt him anymore. But something about the woman's posture, the way she held the small child protectively against her chest, made him turn the deadbolt. When he opened the door, the February cold rushed in along with the sight that would stay with him forever. The woman, who couldn't have been much older than 35, had a bruised cheek and a cut above her left eyebrow. The children behind her ranged from what looked like maybe 14 years old down to the toddler in her arms. They were all underdressed for the Colorado winter, wearing thin jackets and shoes that had seen too many miles. "Please," the woman said, and her voice carried an accent he couldn't immediately place. "My children, they haven't eaten in 2 days. I saw your light on, and I thought maybe—" She trailed off, looking down at the toddler who had begun to whimper. Marcus found himself studying the faces behind her. The oldest child, a girl with the same dark hair as her mother, stood protectively near a boy who might have been 10 or 11. Beside them, twin girls who looked about 8 years old held hands, their eyes wide with the kind of wariness that comes from learning too young that the world isn't safe. "Mom," Marcus started, but stopped when he really looked at them. The children weren't just thin, they were hollow-eyed with hunger. The kind of skinny that spoke of missed meals and empty cupboards, not picky eating or growth spurts. The woman swayed slightly on her feet, and Marcus realized she was injured in more ways than just the obvious bruises on her face. "Where are you from?" he asked, stepping back to let the cold air move between them instead of around them. "Guatemala," she said. "My name is Sofia Morales. These are my children, Maria, Diego, Carmen, Rosa, and this is Mateo." She adjusted the toddler in her arms. "We've been walking for 3 days since our car broke down in Kansas. I have family in Denver, but I lost the address and my phone." She gestured helplessly. Marcus felt something shift in his chest, a loosening of the tight control he'd maintained over his emotions for 3 years. He thought of Elizabeth, who had volunteered at the homeless shelter every Thanksgiving until she became too sick to continue. He thought of the spare bedrooms upstairs that hadn't been used since their son graduated high school 15 years ago. "Come in," he heard himself say, stepping back to open the door wider. "Come in from a cold." The relief that washed over Sophia's face was so profound that Marcus had to look away. The children filed past him quietly, their movements careful and controlled in the way of kids who had learned not to take up too much space. They stood clustered together in his entryway, water dripping from their inadequate shoes onto Elizabeth's welcome mat. "Thank you," Sophia whispered, and Marcus saw tears starting to form in her eyes. "We just need to warm up, maybe use a phone to call my sister." But Marcus was already walking toward the kitchen, his mind racing ahead to the practical matters. When had he last bought groceries? What did children eat for breakfast? He opened the refrigerator and stared at its sparse contents. A carton of eggs past their expiration date, some leftover Chinese takeout, and a half-empty gallon of milk. "Are you hurt?" He called back to Sophia, remembering the way she'd been holding herself. "It's nothing serious," she said, but her voice carried the strain of someone trying to convince herself as much as him. Marcus returned to the living room where the family had arranged themselves on Elizabeth's couch. The children sat perfectly still, their hands folded in their laps, while Sophia kept the toddler on her lap. They looked like they were afraid to breathe too loudly. "When did you last eat?" Marcus asked. The oldest girl, Maria, translated the question into rapid Spanish. Sophia answered, and Maria turned back to Marcus. "She says we found some bread behind a restaurant in Goodland, Kansas. That was Sunday night." Marcus felt something cold settle in his stomach. Today was Wednesday, and before that, another exchange in Spanish. Friday, we think. Someone at a gas station gave us some crackers and juice boxes. The mathematics of their hunger hit Marcus like a physical blow. These children had been surviving on scraps for nearly a week. He thought of his own careful rationing of loneliness, how he'd been so focused on managing his own pain that he'd forgotten there were other kinds of suffering in the world. "Wait here," he said, moving toward the kitchen with more purpose than he'd felt in years. He called the all-night grocery store he'd never shopped at, but whose number was magnet to his refrigerator. Yes, they delivered. No, he didn't care about the early morning surcharge. Milk, bread, eggs, cereal, fruit, whatever they had that children might eat. And orange juice. Elizabeth had always said orange juice made everything a little brighter. While he waited for the delivery, Marcus found himself really looking at his house for the first time in months. The living room, where Elizabeth used to grade papers from her teaching job. The dining room, where they'd hosted holiday dinners for friends who had gradually stopped calling after the funeral. The 4 bedrooms upstairs that had been gathering dust and silence. Sophia had fallen asleep on the couch, her head tilted back and her breathing shallow. The children remained motionless beside her, their eyes following Marcus's movements with the careful attention of prey animals. Only the toddler, Mateo, seemed unaware of the tension, playing quietly with the zipper on his mother's worn jacket. When the grocery delivery arrived 40 minutes later, Marcus felt ridiculous for having to ask the driver to help him carry everything inside. 2 years of bachelor living had left him unprepared for feeding 6 people. The driver, a college-aged kid with kind eyes, didn't ask questions about the early morning emergency shopping trip or the family of strangers sleeping on Marcus's couch. The sound of grocery bags rustling woke Sophia with a start. She jerked upright, her arms instinctively tightening around Mateo, and Marcus saw the fear that flashed across her face before she recognized where she was. "It's okay," Marcus said quickly. "I bought some food. For the children." Sophia said something in Spanish to Maria, who translated. "She wants to know what she can do to pay you back. She says she can clean or cook or—" "She doesn't need to pay me back," Marcus interrupted. "She needs to eat. They all do." As he began unpacking groceries in the kitchen, Marcus heard the children whispering in Spanish behind him. He caught enough words to understand they were trying to figure out if this was real, if they were actually safe, or if this was too good to be true. Their wariness made his chest ache in a way that felt almost like grief, but different, more immediate. He scrambled eggs while bread toasted, poured orange juice into glasses that hadn't been used since the last time his son visited, and tried to remember if there were any rules about feeding children who had been starving. Were you supposed to start slowly? He wished Elizabeth were there to know these things. When he called them to the kitchen, the children moved like a small parade, filing in age order with Maria, bringing up the rear to make sure no one was left behind. They sat around the table where Marcus had eaten alone for 3 years, their eyes wide as he placed plates of food in front of each of them. "Go ahead," he said, but they waited until Sophia nodded her permission before picking up their forks. Marcus had never thought much about the sound of children eating before. The quiet munching, the occasional requests for more past in Spanish between siblings, the way Mateo banged his spoon against his high chair and laughed when Marcus made faces at him. It filled the kitchen with a kind of life he'd forgotten was possible. Sophia ate slowly, carefully, and Marcus noticed she kept glancing toward the window as if expecting someone to appear and take this kindness away. Her face, in a morning light streaming through the breakfast nook, showed the full extent of her injuries. The bruise on her cheek was deep purple and yellow, and there were finger-shaped marks on her neck that made Marcus's hands clench involuntarily. "Where's your family in Denver?" he asked when the immediate hunger seemed satisfied. Sophia spoke to Maria again, and the girl translated. She says her sister lives somewhere near the downtown, but she only had the address written on a paper that got lost when Maria hesitated. "When we had to leave quickly." Marcus nodded, understanding more than was being said. "What about calling information? Do you know your sister's last name? Her husband's name, maybe?" More Spanish conversation. "She married someone with the last name Rodriguez, but Mom doesn't remember his first name. She says there are probably a lot of Rodriguez families in Denver." The practical impossibility of the situation began to settle over Marcus. A woman with 5 children, no money, no transportation, and no way to contact their only connection in a city of over 500,000 people. He thought about calling the police, but something about Sophia's reaction to unexpected sounds, the way she flinched when a car door slammed outside, made him hesitate. "Sophia," he said carefully, using her name for the first time. "Are you running from someone?" The question hung in the air between them. Sophia looked down at her hands, then spoke quietly in Spanish to Maria. The girl's translation came slowly, as if she were choosing her words carefully. "She says her husband hurt her and the children. She says he found out where we were staying in Kansas, and we had to leave in the middle of the night. She's afraid he'll find us again." Marcus felt a familiar anger rising, the same fury he'd experienced during Elizabeth's illness when he realized how powerless he was against forces beyond his control. But this was different. This was something he could do something about. "You're safe here," he said, looking directly at Sophia. "Do you understand? You and the children are safe here." Sophia met his eyes for the first time since they'd arrived. In hers, he saw exhaustion and fear and a kind of desperate hope that she was trying not to let herself feel. She spoke again in Spanish, and Maria's translation made Marcus's throat tight. "She says thank you, but she can't ask you to help more than you already have. She says we'll figure something out." "What if I want to help more?" Marcus asked. The word surprised him as much as anyone else. "What if you stayed here until we find your sister?" The kitchen fell silent, except for the sound of Mateo babbling to himself in his high chair. Sophia stared at Marcus as if he'd spoken in a foreign language, and the other children looked between the adults with the careful attention of kids who had learned to read the emotional temperature of every room they entered. "I have 4 empty bedrooms upstairs," Marcus continued, the idea gaining momentum as he spoke. "I have a washing machine and more food than one person needs. You could stay until we locate your sister, until you figure out what comes next." Sophia's eyes filled with tears, and she spoke rapidly in Spanish. Maria's voice was soft when she translated. She says she can't understand why a stranger would be so kind to people he doesn't know. She wants to know what you want in return. Marcus thought of Elizabeth, of their conversations about legacy and meaning about what they were leaving behind in the world. He thought of his son, busy with his own life, 3 states away, and the silence that had filled his days since he'd stopped pretending to have a purpose. "I want to help," he said simply. "I want you to be safe and warm and fed, and I want to know that there's still some kindness left in the world. That's all I want in return." The tears that had been threatening to fall finally spilled over Sophia's cheeks. She stood from her chair and walked around the table to where Marcus sat. Before he could react, she placed her hands on his shoulders and spoke in Spanish, her voice thick with emotion. "She's blessing you." Maria translated, her own voice wobbling. "She's asking God to bless you for your kindness to strangers." Marcus felt something crack open in his chest, a feeling he couldn't name but recognized as the opposite of the numbness that had carried him through the last 3 years. As Sophia returned to her seat and began helping Mateo with his breakfast, as the other children started to relax enough to actually talk to each other instead of whispering, Marcus realized that opening his door that morning had been the first real choice he'd made since Elizabeth died. The rest of the day passed in a blur of practical arrangements that felt surreal after years of routines designed for one. He showed Sophia and the children upstairs, watched them marvel at the bedrooms with actual beds and clean sheets. He found towels for showers and located the washer and dryer that had sat idle except for his weekly load of clothes that barely filled the machines. By evening, the house felt entirely different. There were voices coming from multiple rooms, the sound of running water that meant someone was actually using the bathrooms upstairs, and the particular energy that comes from children who are finally safe enough to be children again. As Marcus sat in his living room that night, listening to Sophia read a story in Spanish to the younger children, while Maria helped Diego with homework from a backpack that had somehow survived their journey, he realized he couldn't remember what he'd thought about all day, every day before this morning. The careful management of his solitude, the deliberate avoidance of anything that might require him to feel too much, it all seemed like a different person's life. When Sophia came downstairs after getting the children settled in their beds, she found Marcus still sitting in the living room, staring at nothing in particular. "Gracias," she said in English, sitting carefully on the edge of Elizabeth's favorite chair. "Thank you." Marcus nodded, not trusting his voice. They sat in comfortable silence for a while. Two people who had both learned that sometimes life changes completely in the space of a single day, and sometimes that change was exactly what you needed even when you didn't know you needed it. Tomorrow, he thought, they would start looking for her sister in earnest. Tomorrow, he would figure out how to register the children for school if they stayed longer than a few days. Tomorrow, he would call his son and try to explain how his empty house had suddenly become a home again. But tonight, for the first time in 3 years, Marcus Williams fell asleep in a house full of life and dreamed of possibilities instead of endings. The first week passed like a careful dance between strangers learning to share space. Marcus found himself adjusting routines he'd thought were set in stone, while Sophia and her children moved through the house with the quiet efficiency of people who had learned not to leave traces of their presence anywhere. Marcus woke each morning to sounds he'd forgotten houses could make. Water running in multiple bathrooms, quiet voices discussing the day ahead in Spanish, the particular rhythm of children getting ready for activities that suddenly required planning. The sound should have felt intrusive after years of silence, but instead they felt like a house remembering its purpose. On the third day, Marcus drove to the local elementary school to inquire about enrollment procedures. The secretary, a woman named Mrs. Henderson with gray hair and kind eyes, listened to his carefully rehearsed explanation about helping a friend's family while they got settled in Denver. "The children will need immunization records," she said, making notes on a yellow pad. "Birth certificates, previous school records if they're available, proof of address." Marcus realized how little he actually knew about Sophia's situation. They had fallen into a routine of basic survival, meals, clean clothes, safe sleep, but the bureaucratic requirements of normal life felt impossibly complex. When he returned home, he found Sophia hanging laundry in his backyard, something he'd never seen anyone do at his house, but that somehow looked perfectly natural. "I went to the school," he told her through Maria, who had become their primary translator. "They need documents for the children." The conversation that followed, conducted in a mixture of English and Spanish with Maria translating the complex parts, revealed the extent of Sophia's situation. She had birth certificates for all the children, hidden in a small bag she kept with her at all times. But school records from Guatemala were nearly impossible to obtain, and immunization records have been lost during their hasty departure from Kansas. She says she understands if this is too complicated. Maria translated. "She says maybe we should try to find our aunt without bothering you more." Marcus found himself shaking his head before Maria finished speaking. "Tell your mother that we'll figure it out. Tell her that's what families do. They figure things out together." The word families hung in the air, and Marcus saw Sophia's eyes widen with something that might have been hope or might have been fear. He hadn't meant to say it, but once the word was out, it felt surprisingly right. Over the following days, Marcus threw himself into solving problems with an energy he hadn't felt since Elizabeth's illness. He researched immunization requirements and found a clinic that would work with families without insurance. He contacted a lawyer who specialized in immigration issues and learned about programs that might help Sophia establish legal residency. He spent hours on the phone with various social services agencies, navigating bureaucratic mazes that seemed designed to discourage rather than help. During these phone calls, made from his home office while Sophia kept the children occupied in other rooms, Marcus began to piece together more of their story. Sophia's husband, Carlos, had a history of violence that had escalated after they moved to Kansas. He had connections through his construction job that made him capable of tracking them across states. The family had lived in fear for months before Sophia finally gathered the courage to run. The more Marcus learned, the more determined he became to help them disappear completely into the anonymity of suburban Denver. He researched schools in different districts, looked into programs that helped domestic violence survivors establish new identities, and began to understand that what Sophia needed wasn't just temporary shelter. It was a complete fresh start. Meanwhile, the children were adapting to stability in ways that broke and mended Marcus's heart daily. Diego, the 10-year-old boy, had claimed the garage as his territory and spent hours arranging and rearranging tools with the focus of someone who had rarely been allowed to touch things without permission. The twins, Carmen and Rosa, had discovered Marcus's collection of Elizabeth's teaching books and spent every afternoon looking at pictures and sounding out English words to each other. Maria, at 14, appointed herself as the family's bridge between languages and cultures. She helped Marcus understand which foods the younger children would and wouldn't eat, which sounds at night might frighten them, and how to navigate the complex dynamics of siblings who had learned to protect each other in ways that most children never had to learn. And Mateo, not quite 3 years old, had attached himself to Marcus with the wholehearted devotion of a child who had no memory of men being anything other than sources of fear and violence. He followed Marcus around the house, chattering in a mixture of Spanish and the English words he was picking up with startling speed, and had claimed Marcus's lap as his preferred location for watching the children's television programs Marcus found himself recording. 2 weeks into their stay, Marcus was in his kitchen making dinner when he heard Sophia scream from the living room. He ran toward the sound and found her standing at the front window, her body rigid with terror, staring at something in the street. "What is it?" Marcus asked, but Sophia was already backing away from the window, calling for the children in rapid Spanish. Maria appeared at the top of the stairs. "Mom says there's a man outside watching the house. She thinks it might be him." Marcus moved to the window carefully. A dark pickup truck was parked across the street, and he could see the silhouette of someone in the driver's seat. The truck had been there for about 10 minutes, long enough to be more than just someone making a phone call or checking directions. "Take everyone upstairs," Marcus told Maria quietly. "Lock the door to one of the bedrooms and don't come out until I tell you." As the family disappeared upstairs with Sophia carrying Mateo and the other children moving with the practiced silence of people who had hidden before, Marcus felt a cold anger settling in his chest. He thought of Sophia's bruises, of the way the children still flinched at sudden movements, of the carefully controlled way they had learned to exist in the world. He walked outside onto his front porch, making no attempt to be subtle about it. The evening air was crisp, and streetlights were beginning to come on in the gathering dusk. Marcus stood on his porch and stared directly at the pickup truck, crossing his arms and making it clear that he hadn't noticed the surveillance. After about 5 minutes, the truck's engine started. As it drove past Marcus's house slowly, he got a good look at the driver, a heavy-set man with a mustache and the kind of predatory attention that made Marcus's skin crawl. The man stared back at Marcus as he drove by, and Marcus committed every detail to memory. When he went back inside, he found Sophia sitting at the bottom of the stairs, her hands shaking as she tried to hold a cup of tea that Maria had brought her. "Was it him?" Marcus asked. Sophia nodded, and when she spoke, her voice was barely audible. "Carlos. He found us." The next hour was spent in what Marcus could only describe as a war council. With Maria translating, Sophia explained that Carlos had probably tracked them through her sister's phone number, which Sophia had called from the gas station in Kansas before their phone died. He was resourceful and persistent, and he would not stop looking for them. "We have to leave," Sophia said through Maria. "Tonight. If we stay, he'll hurt you too." "No," Marcus said firmly. "Running didn't work before. Running won't work now." He excused himself and made a phone call to Officer Janet Roberts, a community police officer he'd met during a neighborhood watch meeting years earlier. When he explained the situation, leaving out some of the details about immigration status, but emphasizing the domestic violence and the presence of children, Officer Roberts took the threat seriously. We can't arrest him for sitting in a truck on a public street, she explained. But we can definitely increase patrols in your area, and if he makes any attempt to approach the house or the family, we can intervene. Marcus also called the lawyer he'd been speaking with about Sophia's situation. The conversation was sobering. While there were legal protections for domestic violence victims, the process of obtaining them required Sophia to essentially make herself visible to the system at a time when her primary need was to remain hidden. There are safe houses, the lawyer explained, but they're temporary and, honestly, they're often not as safe as you might think. If this man is as determined as you describe, nowhere is going to be completely secure. When Marcus shared this information with Sophia, he watched her face cycle through despair, determination, and something that looked like resignation. She spoke in Spanish for several minutes, and when Maria translated, her voice was heavy with adult concerns that no 14-year-old should have to carry. She says she's grateful for everything you've done, but she can't ask you to put yourself in danger for people you barely know. She says Carlos is violent, and he won't hesitate to hurt anyone who helps us. Marcus looked around his living room, at the evidence of children's presence everywhere. Diego's homework spread across the coffee table, Rose's drawings taped to the refrigerator, Mateo's toys scattered across the carpet in the particular chaos that comes from being safe enough to leave things where you played with them. "This is my house," he said finally, "and you're my family now, whether you've been here 2 weeks or 20 years. Nobody threatens my family." The simplicity of his statement seemed to surprise Sophia as much as it surprised him. But, as he said the words, Marcus realized they were completely true. Somewhere in the past 2 weeks, without his conscious decision, these 5 children and their mother had become the center of his world in a way he'd thought was no longer possible. They spent the rest of the evening making practical preparations. Marcus installed motion sensor lights around his property and checked that all the window locks were secure. He moved his car to the garage and gave Sophia the opener so she could bring the children in through the back of the house without being visible from the street. He programmed Officer Roberts' direct number into every phone in the house. Most importantly, he sat down with each of the children individually and explained that there might be some danger, but that he was going to make sure they stayed safe. With Maria translating for the younger ones, he assured them that they didn't need to be afraid, but they did need to be careful and follow some new rules about staying inside and not answering the door. Diego, serious beyond his 10 years, asked if Marcus had ever been in a fight. When Marcus admitted he hadn't, not since middle school anyway, Diego nodded thoughtfully and then asked if Marcus thought Carlos would try to hurt him. "I don't know," Marcus answered honestly, "but I know that protecting you and your family is the most important thing I can do, and I'm going to do it no matter what." That night, Marcus barely slept. He found himself getting up every hour to check the windows, to make sure the motion lights were working, to convince himself that the quiet sounds he was hearing were the normal settling of a house, rather than someone trying to break in. Around 3 in the morning, he heard footsteps in the hallway and found Sophia standing outside his bedroom door with Mateo in her arms. "I couldn't sleep either," she said in careful English. They went downstairs together and sat in the kitchen, sharing coffee and the kind of silence that comes from 2 people who are both worried about the same things. Mateo slept against his mother's shoulder, occasionally making the small sounds that children make when they're dreaming. "Why are you doing this?" Sophia asked suddenly. Her English was better than she usually let on, Marcus realized. "You don't know us. We could be anyone." Marcus thought about how to answer that question. He thought about Elizabeth, about the empty years since her death, about the way his life had felt like something he was just enduring rather than living. "I think maybe you saved me as much as I'm helping you," he said finally. "I was disappearing before you came. I was turning into someone who didn't matter to anyone, including myself." Sophia shifted Mateo to a more comfortable position and studied Marcus's face in the dim kitchen light. "In Guatemala, we have a saying, God puts people in your path when you both need to find each other." "I like that saying," Marcus said. "My grandmother used to tell me that sometimes the family you choose is stronger than the family you're born into, because chosen family is held together by love instead of just obligation." They sat in comfortable silence after that. 2 people who had found themselves responsible for protecting something precious and fragile, and who were discovering that the responsibility felt less like a burden and more like a purpose. When morning came, Marcus called in sick to his job at the accounting firm, where he'd been working part-time since retirement. It was the first sick day he'd taken in over 2 years, But the idea of leaving Sophia and the children alone in the house while Carlos was somewhere in Denver felt impossible. He spent the day researching security systems and researching Carlos Morales, using what little information Sophia had been able to provide. What he found in public records was disturbing: arrests for domestic violence in 2 different states, a restraining order that had been filed and then mysteriously dropped, and employment record that showed he had moved frequently, always seeming to leave jobs under circumstances that weren't quite explained in the official paperwork. But Marcus also found something else. Carlos had been arrested in Kansas just 3 days earlier for driving under the influence and had spent 2 nights in jail before making bail. The timeline meant he had driven straight from Kansas to Denver after his release, confirming that his appearance at Marcus's house wasn't coincidental. He was actively hunting for Sophia and the children. This information led Marcus to another phone call with the lawyer, who explained that the recent arrest might actually work in their favor if they decided to pursue legal action. A man with a history of domestic violence who was now potentially violating restraining orders across state lines was exactly the kind of case that law enforcement took seriously. The question, the lawyer said, is whether your friend is ready to make herself visible to the legal system. Because once we start this process, there's no hiding anymore. When Marcus shared this information with Sophia, she was quiet for a long time. Then, she asked Maria to take the other children upstairs so she could think without having to worry about what they were hearing. "I've been running for so long," Sophia said, speaking mostly in English now. "First from him, then from the police who wouldn't help, then from Kansas when he found us there. I'm tired of running, but I'm more afraid of what happens if we stop." Marcus understood the impossible choice she was facing. Standing and fighting meant risking everything, but continuing to run meant never having a real life, never allowing her children to feel truly safe anywhere. "Whatever you decide," he told her, "we'll face it together. You and the children aren't alone anymore." Sophia nodded, and Marcus could see her making the decision that would change all of their lives. "Okay," she said finally, "we stop running." The decision to stop running transformed the house into a fortress of determination and hope. Sophia's choice to stand and fight unleashed something powerful in both her and Marcus, a shared resolve that surprised them with its intensity. What had begun as temporary shelter evolved into a deliberate collaboration to build something permanent and safe. Marcus spent the following Monday morning at the law offices of Patricia Chun, the immigration attorney who specialized in domestic violence cases. The waiting room smelled like coffee and determination, filled with women and men clutching folders of documents that represented their entire histories in this country. Marcus realized he was probably the only person there who wasn't personally facing deportation or family separation, and the weight of that privilege made him more determined to use his resources wisely. Patricia Chun was a small woman with steel in her voice and 30 years of experience written in the lines around her eyes. She listened to Marcus explain Sophia's situation while taking notes in shorthand that looked like a secret code. "The U visa is probably our best option," she explained when Marcus finished. "It's specifically designed for victims of domestic violence who are willing to cooperate with law enforcement. If Sophia is willing to file formal charges against Carlos and testify if necessary, she and the children could qualify for legal status that would eventually lead to permanent residency." "What's the catch?" Marcus asked, because his experience with bureaucracy had taught him there was always a catch. "The catch is that she has to stop hiding and become visible to the system. She has to trust that the same government agencies that she's been avoiding will now protect her. And she has to be willing to face Carlos in court, knowing that he'll probably be arrested and that might make him more dangerous in the short term." Marcus absorbed this information while Patricia explained the timeline. Months of paperwork, interviews, background checks, and the constant possibility that something would go wrong, and Sophia would find herself in deportation proceedings instead of protection proceedings. "There's something else you should know," Patricia added. "The U visa has a cap of 10,000 per year, and applications have been running about 4 times higher than that. So even if Sophia qualifies, she could be waiting years for actual approval." Marcus drove home with his head spinning from the complexity of a system that seemed designed to discourage the people who most needed its help. But when he explained the situation to Sophia, her response surprised him. "I want to do it," she said without hesitation. "I want to file the charges and apply for the visa. My children deserve to live somewhere without looking over their shoulders." The first step was getting Sophia to a hospital to document her injuries properly. Marcus had noticed that she still moved carefully, favoring her left side, and that she occasionally grimaced when she thought no one was watching. The emergency room at Presbyterian St. Joseph was busy with the usual Monday afternoon chaos, but the intake nurse took one look at Sophia's fading bruises and moved them quickly through triage. Dr. Rebecca Martinez, herself originally from El Salvador, conducted the examination with the gentle efficiency of someone who had seen too many women in Sophia's situation. She documented a cracked rib that had been healing incorrectly, bruising consistent with being grabbed and shaken, and defensive wounds on Sophia's hands and arms. "You need to file a police report," Dr. Martinez told Sophia in Spanish. "And you need to stay somewhere safe while this heals properly." "She's staying with me," Marcus said. "She and her children are safe." Dr. Martinez studied Marcus with the assessing look of someone who had learned to be protective of vulnerable patients. Whatever she saw on his face seemed to satisfy her, because she nodded and began preparing the medical report that would become crucial evidence in Sophia's case. The police report was filed that afternoon with Officer Roberts, who had been expecting them. The formal process of describing Carlos's violence, of putting dates and locations and specific details into an official document, seemed to exhaust Sophia more than the physical examination had. But Marcus watched her strengthen with each piece of bureaucratic armor they assembled around her family. "Now we wait to see if he's still in Denver," Officer Roberts explained. "And if he approaches you or your family again, we have grounds for immediate arrest." They didn't have to wait long. The next evening, as Marcus was helping Diego with homework in the dining room while Sophia prepared dinner in the kitchen, the motion sensor lights in the backyard suddenly blazed on. Marcus looked through the kitchen window and saw Carlos Morales standing at the fence that separated Marcus's yard from the alley behind his house. For a moment, the two men stared at each other through the glass. Carlos was bigger than Marcus had expected, with the kind of casual menace that came from years of using physical intimidation to get what he wanted. Marcus felt fear settle in his stomach like cold water, but he also felt something else, a protective fury that surprised him with its intensity. Marcus called 911 first, then Patricia Chin's emergency number, then moved through the house, systematically checking that all doors and windows were locked. Sophia had gathered the children in the living room, away from windows, and they sat clustered together on the couch with the particular stillness that came from practiced hiding. The police arrived within 6 minutes. Marcus watched through the front window as two patrol cars converged on the alley, and then as Carlos was placed in handcuffs and led away. The entire interaction lasted less than 20 minutes, but those 20 minutes felt like the turning point they had all been waiting for. Officer Roberts came to the door to explain what happened next. "We're holding him on charges of stalking and violating the restraining order that was filed in Kansas. With his record, he's probably looking at serious jail time, especially if we can connect him to the domestic violence charges Mrs. Morales is filing." "Is he going to get bail?" Marcus asked, thinking of Sophia's pale face when she'd seen Carlos in the backyard. "Probably, eventually, but it'll be high, and it'll come with conditions that include staying away from you and your family. If he violates those conditions again, he'll be looking at federal charges for interstate stalking." That night, for the first time since Sophia and the children had arrived at his house, Marcus slept deeply and dreamlessly. The immediate threat had been contained, and the legal machinery that would protect them was finally in motion. Over the following weeks, Marcus discovered that building a new life was more complicated and more rewarding than he had anticipated. Enrolling the children in school required 3 separate visits to the administration building, armed with medical records, legal documentation, and the kind of patient persistence that Marcus remembered from helping Elizabeth navigate her cancer treatments. Maria started at the local high school, where her careful English and serious dedication to catching up academically made her a favorite among teachers who appreciated students who understood education as a privilege rather than an obligation. Diego and the twins were placed in elementary school programs designed to help children transition into English language instruction. Mateo, almost 3 years old, was enrolled in a preschool program that specialized in working with children who had experienced trauma. Marcus found himself learning an entirely new vocabulary around childhood development, therapeutic play, and the ways that safety could be rebuilt in small, daily increments. The logistics of suddenly parenting 5 children stretched Marcus in ways he hadn't expected. Soccer practice for Diego and Rosa, parent-teacher conferences conducted through translators, birthday parties that required navigation between cultural traditions and American expectations. Marcus found himself busier and more engaged with life than he had been since Elizabeth's death. But it was the small moments that transformed him most completely. Teaching Mateo to ride the tricycle they'd found at a thrift store. Helping Carmen with a science project about volcanoes. Listening to Maria practice her English by reading newspaper articles aloud. And asking questions about American politics and culture that made Marcus think more deeply about his own country than he had in years. Sophia, meanwhile, was building her own new life with the determined focus of someone who understood that safety was something you had to construct deliberately. She enrolled in English classes at the community college and started volunteering at a local nonprofit that helped other domestic violence survivors navigate the legal system. "I want to become someone who helps other women like me," she told Marcus one evening as they sat in the kitchen after the children had gone to bed. "I want them to know that it's possible to start over." The U-Visa application process moved forward with bureaucratic slowness, but moved forward nonetheless. Patricia Chun shepherded them through interviews with immigration officials, background checks that seemed to examine every day of Sophia's life since childhood, and the endless paperwork that documented her transformation from victim to survivor to legal resident. Carlos, meanwhile, remained in jail pending trial on multiple charges. The district attorney's office had connected his case to a pattern of domestic violence that crossed state lines, making it a federal matter with serious consequences. Patricia explained that even if he was eventually released, the legal protections around Sophia and her children would be substantial and enforceable. 3 months after that February morning, when Sophia had knocked on his door, Marcus realized that his house had become something entirely different from what it had been. The silence that had once seemed peaceful now would have felt oppressive. The routines that had once provided structure now would have seemed empty. The careful management of solitude that had once seemed necessary now seemed like a waste of the capacity for connection that he had almost allowed to atrophy completely. One Saturday morning in May, Marcus was in the backyard teaching Diego how to use a power drill to build a treehouse when he heard Sophia calling his name from the kitchen window. The tone of her voice made him stop what he was doing and run toward the house. "Marcus," she said when he reached the kitchen, and he could see that she was holding a letter with shaking hands. The visa application. It was approved. Marcus stared at her, not quite believing what he was hearing. The U-Visa that Patricia had warned them might take years to process had been approved in just under 4 months. "What does that mean?" he asked, though he thought he knew. "It means we can stay," Sophia said, and then she was crying and laughing at the same time. "It means my children can grow up here and go to school here and not have to be afraid anymore." The celebration that followed involved all 5 children, a hastily prepared dinner that turned into a feast, and phone calls to Patricia Chun, Officer Roberts, Dr. Martinez, and everyone else who had helped make this day possible. But in the middle of the chaos, Marcus found himself standing in his living room looking at his family, because that's what they had become, his family, and feeling something like wonder at how completely his life had changed. Maria, now comfortable enough with English to express complex thoughts, found him in the quiet moment after dinner. "Marcus," she said, using the name they'd all started calling him instead of Sir or Mr. "Mom wants to know if you would consider being our guardian officially, like with papers and everything." Marcus felt something shift in his chest, a feeling that was part surprise and part recognition of something he'd been hoping for without realizing it. "What do you think about that?" he asked Maria. "I think," Maria said carefully, "that you're already our family anyway. The papers would just make it official." That night, after the children were in bed and Sophia had called her sister in Mexico to share the good news, Marcus sat in his home office researching guardianship law and family court procedures. The legal process would be complex, but no more complex than anything else they had navigated together. What struck him was how natural the decision felt. Somewhere in the past 3 months, he had stopped thinking about Sophia and her children as people he was helping and started thinking of them simply as his family. The distinction mattered less in daily life than it did in his understanding of who he was and what his purpose had become. Marcus had spent the years since Elizabeth's death convinced that his capacity for love and protection had died with her. But, sitting in his office, planning the legal steps that would make him officially responsible for 5 children he had known for less than 6 months, he realized that love wasn't a finite resource that got used up and exhausted. It was something that grew to meet whatever demands life placed on it. He thought of Elizabeth, of their conversations about legacy and meaning, about what they wanted their lives to add up to when all was said and done. He thought she would have liked Sophia and her children. More than that, he thought she would have been proud of the man he had become in the process of protecting them. Outside his office window, Marcus could see the treehouse that he and Diego were building, still unfinished but already claimed by the twins as their castle, their fort, their private place where they could be children without worrying about anything more serious than whether it might rain. Tomorrow, he would finish installing the roof, and Sophia would help him hang the rope ladder that would allow even Mateo to climb up when he got a little older. Tomorrow, they would start the paperwork that would make him legally responsible for 5 children who had taught him that family wasn't something you were born into, but something you chose to build one day and one decision at a time. Tomorrow, he would officially become the father he had never expected to be again, and the man Elizabeth had always believed he could become. But tonight, Marcus Williams fell asleep in a house full of the people he loved most in the world, and dreamed of all the tomorrows they would build together. The guardianship hearing was scheduled for a Tuesday morning in September, 8 months after Sophia had first knocked on Marcus's door. The Denver family court building buzzed with the controlled chaos of people reshaping their lives through legal documentation. Divorces, adoptions, custody arrangements, and in Marcus's case, the formal recognition of a family that had formed through circumstance and solidified through choice. Patricia Chun had prepared them extensively for what to expect. The judge would want to understand the children's living situation, their emotional well-being, their educational progress, and, most importantly, whether this arrangement truly served their best interests. Social workers had visited the house multiple times, conducting interviews with each child individually and observing the family dynamics that had evolved over the past months. Marcus wore the same suit he'd worn to Elizabeth's funeral, altered now to fit a body that had filled out from cooking for 6 people instead of barely feeding himself. Sophia sat beside him in a navy dress that Maria had helped her choose, her hands steady now when they had once shaken constantly. The children were arranged in age order on the benches behind them, dressed in their best clothes and radiating the particular seriousness that comes from understanding that important things are happening. Judge Rebecca Foster, a woman in her 50s with kind eyes and the efficient manner of someone who had seen every possible variation of family complexity, called their case with a warmth that immediately eased Marcus's nervousness. "This is an unusual situation," she began, reviewing the thick file that documented their journey from strangers to family. "Mr. Williams, when you took in Ms. Morales and her children, did you have any expectation that this would become a permanent arrangement?" Marcus had practiced this answer, but in the moment, the practiced words felt inadequate. "Your Honor, I thought I was helping them for a few days until they could find Sophia's sister. I had no idea that they would change my life so completely, or that I would discover that being their guardian wasn't a responsibility I was taking on, but a privilege I was being given." Judge Foster made notes as Marcus spoke, then turned her attention to Sophia. "Ms. Morales, you're voluntarily granting guardianship rights to Mr. Williams. Can you explain your decision?" Sophia had been practicing her English for this moment, working with Marcus and Maria to make sure she could express herself clearly. "Your Honor, Marcus saved our lives, but more than that, he gave my children something I could not give them alone, a father who loves them not because he has to, but because he chooses to every day. He is the safest person I have ever known and the best man my children have ever had in their lives." The judge then spoke individually with each child, starting with Maria. At 14, Maria had become the family's unofficial spokesperson, but in the formal setting of the courtroom, her responses revealed the depth of thought she had given to their situation. "Marcus doesn't try to replace our father," Maria explained carefully. "He understands that Carlos was our biological father, but he also understands that being a father is about more than biology. Marcus chose us when he didn't have to, and he's been choosing us every day since then." Diego, now 11 and more confident than the frightened boy who had hidden behind his mother 8 months earlier, told the judge about learning to build things in Marcus's garage, about homework help that never felt like criticism, about having someone who came to soccer games not because he was obligated to, but because he genuinely wanted to watch Diego play. The twins, Carmen and Rosa, spoke in their careful, synchronized way about feeling safe for the first time they could remember, about having their own beds and their own space, about a house where loud voices meant laughter instead of anger. Even Mateo, now 3.5 and largely English-speaking, was brought forward to speak with the judge. His contribution was simple but devastating in its clarity. When asked who Marcus was, he said, "That's my daddy. He reads me stories and makes pancakes, and he doesn't yell ever." Judge Foster asked Marcus about his financial situation, his support system, his plans for the children's education, and his understanding of the long-term commitment he was making. She asked Sophia about her own plans and how she envisioned co-parenting with Marcus as the children's guardian. "We've already been co-parenting for 8 months, Sophia explained. "Marcus and I make decisions together about the children's schooling, their discipline, their activities. He doesn't try to replace me as their mother, but he supports me in ways that make me a better parent than I could be alone." The social worker who had been assigned to their case, Janet Martinez, provided her report to the court. She had visited the house multiple times, interviewed neighbors, spoken with the children's teachers, and observed family interactions during both planned and unplanned visits. "This is one of the most stable and nurturing family environments I have encountered in 15 years of social work," she told the judge. "The children have thrived academically, emotionally, and socially under Mr. Williams's guardianship. Their relationship with their mother has strengthened rather than been undermined by his presence in their lives. I recommend approval without reservation." Judge Foster reviewed the medical reports documenting the children's improved health and growth since living with Marcus, the school reports showing academic progress that exceeded expectations, and the psychological evaluation that had been conducted to ensure the children were processing their trauma in healthy ways. "Mr. Williams," she said finally, "guardianship is a serious legal responsibility. You would be making educational decisions, medical decisions, and financial decisions for 5 children. You would be legally responsible for their welfare until they reach 18 years of age. Do you understand the magnitude of this commitment?" "Your Honor," Marcus replied, "I've been making those decisions and accepting that responsibility for 8 months already. The only thing that would change is that it would finally be official." Judge Foster smiled at that response, and Marcus felt some of the tension leave his shoulders. "In that case," she said, "I hereby grant legal guardianship of Maria Elena Morales, Diego Carlos Morales, Carmen Sofia Morales, Rosa Maria Morales, and Mateo Jesus Morales to Marcus James Williams, effective immediately." The celebration in the courtroom was restrained by judicial protocol, but the celebration that followed at Chuck E. Cheese was anything but restrained. Marcus found himself in the surreal position of being the only adult supervising 5 children in a restaurant designed to induce sensory overload, while simultaneously feeling more peaceful and content than he had in years. That evening, as they gathered around the kitchen table that had become the center of their family life, Marcus realized that the legal documentation had changed surprisingly little about their daily reality. He was still the person who helped with homework, attended parent-teacher conferences, and made the thousands of small decisions that constitute daily child-rearing. Sophia was still the mother who set behavioral expectations, provided cultural guidance, and maintained the primary emotional connections with each child. What had changed was the security that all of them felt. The children no longer worried that some bureaucratic decision might separate them from the stability they had found. Sophia no longer carried the burden of single parenthood in a country where she had no support system. And Marcus no longer questioned whether he had the right to make long-term plans for their shared future. The weeks following the guardianship hearings settled into the rhythms of an established family preparing for the holidays. Marcus discovered the complexity of navigating between American traditions and Guatemalan customs, creating new family traditions that honored both cultures while building something uniquely their own. Maria started talking about college applications, something that would have been impossible without legal status and financial stability. Her grades had earned her attention from several universities, and Marcus found himself learning about scholarship applications, SAT preparation, and the particular challenges faced by first-generation college students. Diego joined the school's robotics club and discovered a talent for engineering that reminded Marcus of his own love of building and fixing things. They spent Saturday mornings in the garage working on increasingly ambitious projects, and Diego started talking about maybe becoming an engineer someday, a possibility that had seemed impossible when his primary concern was finding enough food to eat. The twins developed distinct personalities as they became secure enough to explore their individual interests. Carmen gravitated toward art and spent hours drawing elaborate pictures of their family, their house, and imagined futures that invariably included everyone they loved safely gathered in the same place. Rosa discovered a love of reading that led to weekly library visits and bedtime stories as she increasingly read to Mateo instead of having read to her. Mateo, now fully bilingual and completely confident in his place in the family, started preschool with the easy adaptability of a child who had never known anything but security and love. His teacher commented on his unusual emotional maturity and his protective instincts toward classmates who seemed sad or scared. Sophia began taking courses toward becoming a certified medical interpreter, building on her growing English skills and her desire to help other Spanish-speaking families navigate healthcare systems. Her own experience of feeling lost and voiceless in medical settings motivated her to ensure that other families wouldn't face the same barriers. The house itself had transformed to accommodate their expanded life. The garage had become Diego's workshop and Marcus's teaching space. The basement had been converted into a playroom where the younger children could be children without worrying about making too much noise. Elizabeth's former craft room had become Maria's study space, filled with college prep books and scholarship applications. But perhaps the most significant change was in Marcus himself. The careful solitude that had defined his widowhood had been replaced by the comfortable chaos of a house full of people who needed him and whom he needed in return. He woke up each morning with immediate purpose: breakfast to make, lunch money to distribute, permission slips to sign, and the thousand small responsibilities that made him feel essential rather than optional. The first anniversary of Sophia's arrival at his door passed almost without notice, marked only by Marcus's private moment of gratitude as he stood in his kitchen making breakfast for 6 people instead of coffee for one. In 12 months, everything about his life had changed except the house itself, which had simply remembered its purpose as a place where families grew and thrived. That evening, Sophia found Marcus in the backyard, where he was grading the area where they planned to plant a garden in the spring. The children were inside, doing homework and watching television, creating the background soundtrack of family life that had become the music of Marcus's contentment. "I never thank you properly," Sophia said, settling on the porch steps where she could watch Marcus work. "For what?" Marcus asked, pausing in his raking. "For seeing us as people worth saving when we couldn't see it ourselves. For choosing us when you could have chosen safety and quiet. For becoming the father my children needed when I couldn't give them one myself." Marcus leaned against his rake and considered her words. "I think maybe we saved each other," he said finally. "I was disappearing before you came. I was becoming someone who didn't matter to anyone, including myself." "Do you ever regret it?" Sophia asked. "The complication, the noise, the expense, the responsibility?" Marcus looked through the kitchen window at Maria, helping the twins with math homework, while Diego built something complex out of Legos, and Mateo colored in a coloring book with the intense concentration that 3-year-olds brought to important projects. "I regret that it took me so long to understand what family really means," he said. "I regret that I wasted 3 years thinking that love was something you could use up instead of something that grows to meet whatever demands you place on it. But do I regret answering the door that morning? Never. Not for a single moment." That night, as Marcus made his rounds checking that doors were locked and children were sleeping safely, he stopped in each bedroom to watch them for a moment. Maria, surrounded by the college brochures that represented dreams that were now actually achievable. Diego, with his latest robotics project on his nightstand and his toolkit carefully organized on his desk. The twins in their shared room, Rosa with a book still open beside her pillow, and Carmen with her latest artwork taped to the wall beside her bed. And finally, Mateo, sleeping in a toddler bed they'd bought when it became clear that his crib days were officially over, clutching the stuffed dinosaur that Marcus had bought him for his 3rd birthday. In each room, Marcus felt the particular satisfaction that comes from knowing that the people you love are safe, fed, warm, and dreaming of futures that no longer included fear or uncertainty. It was a satisfaction he'd thought he would never feel again after Elizabeth's death, and its return felt like a miracle of ordinary magnitude. As he settled into his own bed, Marcus thought about the year ahead, Maria's high school graduation and college applications, Diego's increasing sophistication in his engineering projects, the twins' growing independence and individual interests, Mateo's development from toddler to actual little boy with opinions and preferences, and the budding personality of someone who had never known anything but love and security. He thought about Sophia's plans to finish her medical interpreter certification and the part-time job she was considering at the hospital where Dr. Martinez worked. He thought about the garden they would plant in the spring and the vacation they were planning for next summer, the first real vacation any of the children had ever taken. But mostly, Marcus thought about the peculiar alchemy that had transformed six strangers into a family, and how the best things in life often came disguised as interruptions to plans you thought were working perfectly well already. Tomorrow would bring the usual challenges of parenting 5 children with different needs, different dreams, and different ways of moving through the world. But tonight, Marcus Williams fell asleep in a house full of the people who had taught him that family was not something that happened to you, but something you chose to build one decision and one day at a time. 5 years after that cold February morning, when desperation knocked on his door, Marcus Williams stood in the auditorium of Jefferson High School, watching his oldest daughter walk across the stage to receive her diploma. Maria Elena Morales Williams. She had chosen to hyphenate her name after the adoption was finalized, graduated 3rd in her class with a full scholarship to the University of Colorado's pre-med program. The family filled an entire row. Sophia sat beside Marcus, tears streaming down her face as she watched her firstborn achieve something that had seemed impossible during those desperate days when survival was their only goal. Diego, now 16 and 6 inches taller than Marcus, held Mateo on his lap so the 8-year-old could see over the heads in front of them. The twins, Carmen and Rosa, now 13, and navigating the complex terrain of middle school with the confidence of children who had never doubted their place in the world, clutched the flowers they would present to Maria after the ceremony. As Maria's name was called, and she crossed the stage with the poised dignity of someone who understood the magnitude of her achievement, Marcus felt Elizabeth's presence in a way he hadn't experienced since her death. Not sadness or loss, but a warm certainty that she was somehow present for this moment, proud of the man he had become and the family he had chosen to build. The years had not been without challenges. There had been nights when 5 children with homework in 3 different languages had tested every limit of Marcus's patience and organizational skills. There had been teenage rebellion from Diego that included a brief but terrifying flirtation with the kind of friends who offered easy answers to complicated questions about identity and belonging. There had been Carmen's struggles with anxiety that required therapy and medication, and the patient work of helping her understand that safety was not just external, but something that had to be built internally as well. There had been bureaucratic battles over immigration paperwork, college financial aid applications that required documentation they didn't have, and the ongoing complexity of navigating between 2 cultures while building something new that honored both. There had been sick days, emergency room visits, parent-teacher conferences, soccer tournaments, school plays, science fairs, and the thousands of ordinary moments that constitute the daily work of raising children. But there had also been graduations from elementary school, first jobs and driver's licenses, science fair victories, and art show ribbons, college acceptance letters, and scholarship awards. There had been Sophia's graduation from her medical interpreter program and her promotion to head of the hospital's language services department. There had been Diego's acceptance into a prestigious summer engineering program, and his growing confidence that he could build a career around his love of creating things. There had been the twins' discovery that they were not identical in interests or dreams. Carmen's artistic talents had led to acceptance at a specialized arts high school, while Rosa's academic achievements had earned her placement in advanced mathematics courses that challenged even Maria's former academic supremacy. And there had been Mateo's transformation from a traumatized toddler to a confident 8-year-old who served as the family's unofficial ambassador to the world, making friends everywhere he went, and approaching life with the fearless optimism of someone who had never known anything but love and security. Marcus had also discovered that becoming a parent at 62 required adjustments he hadn't anticipated. His knees protested more loudly during Diego's weekend construction projects. His hearing struggled with the volume levels that seemed natural to teenagers. His understanding of technology lagged embarrassingly behind even Mateo's growing digital literacy. But he had also discovered reserves of energy and patience he hadn't known he possessed. Love, it turned out, was indeed renewable and expandable, growing to meet whatever demands life placed on it. The capacity for joy that he'd thought had died with Elizabeth had not disappeared, but had simply been waiting for the right circumstances to reemerge. After Maria's graduation ceremony, the family gathered at Marcus's house for the celebration dinner that had become their tradition for major milestones. The dining room table, extended to its full length and supplemented by a card table, barely contained the extended family that had grown around their nucleus. Officer Janet Roberts, who had become a close family friend, brought her famous chocolate cake. Dr. Martinez and her husband contributed tamales made from Sophia's mother's recipe, which Sophia had finally managed to recreate after years of phone calls to Guatemala and careful experimentation. Patricia Chun, the lawyer who had guided them through years of legal complexities, brought her teenage daughter and a bottle of champagne for the adults. The neighbors who had watched their transformation from cautious distance to warm friendship contributed side dishes and the kind of easy camaraderie that comes from shared barbecues and borrowed lawnmowers and children who had grown up playing in each other's backyards. As Marcus looked around the table at the 23 people who had gathered to celebrate Maria's achievement, he marveled at how naturally their family had expanded to include everyone who had played a role in their story. This was not the quiet, controlled life he had planned for his retirement, but it was infinitely richer than anything he could have imagined. Maria's speech, delivered in both English and Spanish to accommodate all the gathered languages, focused not on her individual achievement, but on the collective effort that had made it possible. When we knocked on Marcus's door 5 years ago, I was sure my life was over, she said. I couldn't imagine a future beyond surviving each day. I couldn't imagine going to school again, much less college. I couldn't imagine feeling safe anywhere or trusting anyone. She paused to compose herself, and Marcus saw in her face the same determination that had carried her family through their darkest days. But Marcus saw something in us that we couldn't see in ourselves. He saw potential where we saw only problems. He saw a family where we saw only refugees. He saw dreams worth fighting for where we saw only nightmares to escape. And because he believed in our future when we couldn't, I get to stand here today with a college scholarship and a pre-med program and dreams that feel possible instead of impossible. The applause that followed was warm and sustained, but Marcus found himself focusing on Sophia's face as she watched her daughter speak. The transformation in Sophia had been as dramatic as any of the children's. The frightened woman who had begged for help on his doorstep had become a confident professional, a community leader, and an advocate for other families facing the challenges they had overcome. Sophia had started a support group for immigrant mothers dealing with domestic violence, providing translation services and practical guidance for navigating legal and social service systems. She had testified before the state legislature about the need for better resources for domestic violence survivors. She had become the person she had needed during her own darkest days. Your turn, Maria said to Marcus when the applause died down. Speech from Dad. The word Dad still caught Marcus off guard sometimes, even after 5 years. He had never expected to be anyone's father again, much less the father of 5 children who had taught him more about courage and resilience than he had ever taught them about anything. Marcus stood, looking around the table at the faces that had become his world. When I was a young man, I thought family was something that happened to you based on biology and geography. I thought love was finite, that grief was permanent, and that at 62, my story was basically finished. He paused, meeting each child's eyes in turn. You taught me that family is something you choose to build every day. You taught me that love grows stronger when you give it away. You taught me that grief doesn't end, but it can transform into gratitude for having had something worth losing and something worth finding again. Marcus raised his glass of juice. He had stopped drinking alcohol years earlier when he realized that parenting required complete presence and availability. Maria, you taught me that intelligence without kindness is worthless, but intelligence with kindness can change the world. Diego, you taught me that building things with your hands is sacred work, whether you're building a treehouse or building a future. Carmen, you taught me that art makes life beautiful, and that sensitive hearts are not weaknesses but superpowers. Rosa, you taught me that quiet wisdom often speaks louder than loud opinions. And Mateo, you taught me that every day is an adventure when you approach it with curiosity instead of fear. He turned to Sophia, whose tears had started flowing again. And, Sophia, you taught me that the strongest people are often those who ask for help when they need it, and that the best way to honor the people we've lost is to love the people we've found. The toast that followed was multilingual, multi-generational, and filled with the kind of joy that comes from understanding that you are exactly where you belong with exactly the people who matter most. Later that evening, after the guests had gone home, and the dishes had been washed, and the house had settled into its nighttime quiet, Marcus found himself in the backyard where the garden had grown into something approaching Sophia's ambitious vision. Tomatoes and peppers and herbs that connected the family to Guatemala grew alongside Colorado natives that rooted them in their new home. Sophia joined him on the bench they had built together the previous spring, part of Diego's ambitious project to create outdoor living spaces that could accommodate their extended family gatherings. Do you ever think about how different our lives would be if I hadn't knocked on your door that morning? Sophia asked. Marcus considered the question seriously. I think about how close I came to not answering, he admitted. I almost didn't. I was so committed to my isolation, so convinced that I didn't have anything left to give anyone. What changed your mind? I think it was Mateo, Marcus said. Something about seeing a mother holding a child, protecting him even when she couldn't protect herself. It reminded me that there were still people in the world who needed protecting, and maybe I wasn't as useless as I thought I was. They sat in comfortable silence, listening to the sounds of a summer evening in suburban Denver. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked. A car passed on the street in front of the house. Inside, they could hear the muffled sounds of Diego helping Mateo get ready for bed while the twins finished their summer reading assignments. I've been thinking about something, Sophia said. The support group I run at the hospital is getting bigger every month. There's so many families who need what we needed. Not just temporary shelter, but real help building new lives. Marcus turned to look at her, recognizing the tone that meant Sophia was working through an idea that would probably change all their lives in some significant way. What if we started a foundation? Something that could help families transition from survival to stability. Housing assistance, legal help, educational support, job training, all the things that made the difference for us. Marcus felt the familiar stirring of purpose that had become the driving force of his life since Sophia and the children had arrived. You want to help other families the way people helped us. I want to help other families the way you helped us, Sophia corrected. I want to find other people who have room in their lives for families that need rebuilding. I want to connect people who can help with people who need help. The idea took shape between them as they talked, growing from a vague wish to help others into a concrete plan.